Hey there YouTube, I'm Yukitsu, this is Yukitsu Times, welcome to my channel, welcome to the first ever Retrospective. This is going to be a brief review series where I talk a little bit about the games I've completed and the Let's Plays that I've sort of finished on this channel. So that means we're going to be talking about Amnesia, A Dark Descent, and Amnesia Machine for Pigs. I'm actually going to break them up into two different videos so that we can talk a little bit more in depth about each of them, because they are fairly distinct games in their own right. And I don't want to sort of clutter things up by talking about them both at the same time. So, jumping into Amnesia: A Dark Descent, this is a pretty important game in a certain sense, since it really jump-started the idea of horror games in this sort of current age of gaming. Prior to it, it was pretty much dying off a little bit, to a certain extent, around the time of, say, Resident Evil 4, games like that. Just there weren't really any good horror games until Amnesia came along. And now there's a big wave of indie horror games and even fairly big budget horror games that are coming out that are really a lot more fun to play than their predecessors. So what makes Amnesia special is that, well, it's not so much special since there are a lot of imitators nowadays, but what made it special was the way it handled itself in terms of atmosphere and pacing, first and foremost. As a game, it was perfectly willing to let you go for very long stretches without encountering any sort of monster. And that actually had a very strong impact on a lot of players, and a lot of people who were playing the game were able to sort of psych themselves up and really freak themselves out a lot more than was really necessary, considering how rarely you actually saw the monster for the first half of the game. And I think that that's actually a very strong point to this game if you're willing to sort of immerse yourself into it a little bit. The atmosphere in it is really oppressive. It's wonderful. It's very well done. Everywhere you go, you feel like you don't want to keep advancing. You feel like, well, I've been here already. I think it's safe here. I don't want to continue on. But as you sort of continue through the game, that sort of oppressive atmosphere and that feeling that you're going to get killed, you're going to get killed, you're going to get killed, lasts with you. And that's sort of the strongest part of Amnesia: Dark Descent. And the thing about a game where there's that built-up expectation that there's a monster there and never actually paying you off with a monster is that if done correctly, if paced correctly, you will get a profound sense of tension from this. You'll feel wound up and you'll have no sort of release valve. The thing is, actually seeing the monster, actually encountering the monster, running away from it, getting killed by it, or escaping from it, or whatever ends up happening, those are all release valves for that sort of pent-up tension that you're starting to feel. You get wound up further and further. And if you encounter a monster around every corner and it just tries to kill you and you just run away from it, that's an action game. That's not really a horror game, since there's none of that real tension that's had a chance to build up. It's just, you feel a little bit startled, something happens, there's some action. And that's not really what you want to be looking for in a horror game. On the flip side of things, there are games that I think pace themselves a little bit too slowly. They just never have a payoff at all. In those games, what you're going to find is that, you build up all that tension and eventually it just unwinds itself. You don't feel scared anymore because you think, okay, well, it never happens. There's never a monster, so you know what, I'm not going to worry about it anymore. And you want to strike that good balance between that. And Amnesia: Dark Descent really does do that very effectively. Especially in the first half, it's a bit slower at the start and it winds up in speed a little bit towards the end there. I found that the ending, because of that, was a little bit less oppressive, a little bit less atmospheric, and a little bit less scary, but it was effective for delivering that narrative that it wanted to. So there's a lot of pacing going on in this game, and that makes it a very strong horror game. Going on to the mechanics of the game a little bit here. The mechanics of this game are pretty simplistic. There's just a basic adventure-style inventory for the puzzles that you do. There's the collect all of the high score that you can so that you can... I'm not really sure. Strictly speaking, you can get through the entire game without the lamp and without lighting anything. They're just not necessary, so the fact that people are trying to look for them all the time really baffles me a little bit, especially because it's so easy to get by with whatever little bits you have. You don't have to search for them, really. They're just sort of there, I think, to sort of motivate players to look around in dark corners that they should honestly be looking around in anyway. Same with the puzzles. The puzzles feel as though they're there to encourage you to explore. I think that this was one of the cases where the pacing was a little bit off. There were very few puzzles where looking for the puzzle pieces lured you into a scary situation. And I think that that's an opportunity that they really missed out on, that they could have really gone for. They should have definitely done that more often. I think the best puzzle that they had in that regard was finding the serum to protect you against that fungus in the sewers where it was flooded. If they had more puzzles like that, where you're in a very oppressive area, you're literally drilling into a man's head to get his blood. I mean, that was kind of creepy. If they had more puzzles that were sort of like that, I think that would have been a more effective use of them instead of what they did. So mechanically, I don't think this game's particularly strong. I feel that the puzzles were mostly just in there, and the game mechanics were mostly in there to pad the game experience a little bit. But I don't think that they... Well, actually, I do think the puzzles detracted from the gameplay experience a little bit. I don't like puzzles in horror games. They're a very, very commonly used thing. I don't mind puzzles in puzzle games. That's where they belong, in my opinion. But in horror games, what ends up happening is you start thinking about the puzzle, start thinking about the different elements of that, and you think, how do I solve this? How do I get out of here? Blah, blah, blah. But you're not thinking anymore about the horror of the situation. You're not thinking about the setting you're in. You're not thinking about motivations. You're not thinking about anything that I think is more effective at getting beneath your skin, so to say, about the horror setting. And because of that, you end up in this sort of situation where you're releasing your fear and frustration on the puzzle solving when you could instead be feeling oppressed by the atmosphere and the horror of it. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with that, but it comes again down to whether or not you use those puzzles effectively to lure players into bad situations, and they just don't really do that in Amnesia: A Dark Descent. And because of that, I do find that some of the puzzles, which are very strangely executed, they're not very clear on what you're supposed to be doing or why the solution that is correct, because they're sometimes a little bit bizarre. Because they took so long for some cases, or required a guide for me in some cases, I don't really think that they were particularly well executed. If it was a puzzle game, that would have been fine, but that's not what the focus was supposed to have been on. Moving on from the mechanics, the story of this game, here's a part that's extremely subjective in horror games. For me, the story, I could tell from an outside point of view, was very strong in a certain extent, but it didn't work for me. And the reason that it didn't work for me is that I didn't empathize with or really agree with Daniel. Now, there are other people who are going to find that a sort of almost tabula rasa character like Daniel was. Daniel didn't have very many explained traits. He could be a pretty much everyman. Some people are going to find that they can relate to a tabula rasa character because they can fill in the blanks and assume that that's sort of something that they would empathize with. What little that they did talk about Daniel, I didn't really feel connected with me personally. What he is profoundly is somebody who's afraid of dying, of being killed, and is willing to throw everybody else under the bus as a means to that end. So I don't really follow that style of thinking personally. As I've said before, I don't have a particularly strong survival instinct. If there's a bus barreling down at me, I'll move out of the way, but it's not like I actually have an increased heart rate after that happened or anything like that. It's just not really that disturbing to me. So I couldn't really empathize with Daniel's motivation all that strongly. I think I would rather have let the shadow get me as opposed to continuing to kill all these innocent people. However, I do think that justification is one that a lot of people can relate to, and in relating to that, I think that those people will start to sort of question, how far would they go to save themselves? How far would I really do that? Am I really like this? That sort of thing. And that's sort of an element of survival horror. And the problem is this is extremely subjective again, because not everybody can relate to every character. If they try and make the character too generic, it's impossible to connect with them because they become someone with no personality, and no one's going to relate to someone without any personality, without any motivations, without any goals. The character from Outlast is like that. He just isn't really a relatable character in any particular sense, in my opinion. So you're going to have to look for specific character traits, and it's impossible to recommend based on that necessarily, because some people are just going to find that they do relate to a character and other people just aren't, and that's sort of the way of things. So other parts of the story, it follows a pretty traditional narrative arc for horror as a genre, be it a movie or be it a game or whatever. It starts off slowly where nothing is known, everything is mystery, and this is usually the strongest part of a horror game. Amnesia is no exception. And it sort of builds up to a culminating point where you realize that something is profoundly wrong with where you are and that you need to get out at pretty much whatever cost. But then there's a sort of reversing point where you realize what's going on, why it's going on, and the sort of mysteries are dispelled. So you reach that culminating point, and instead of deciding to run away, they decide that they're going to gather up their courage and they're going to go confront the villain of that particular story, and they're going to go get rid of whatever supernatural terror it is or whatever natural terror it is. And that's the sort of arc that Daniel eventually comes to. He eventually decides he's going to confront Alexander, and that Alexander is the one to blame for all this. Alexander put him through all that. Personally, I think that's blame shifting. I think that Daniel is guilty of a lot of Daniel's crimes, but still following along with that narrative. By the end of it, Amnesia, Dark Descent, and pretty much any horror movie or game that follows that formula is less scary in the last chapter, because the player and the audience and the characters all also have to have come to that conclusion that there is a villain, and if I stop it, everything is going to go back to normal and everything is going to be fine. And that motivation that is beyond simple getting away from the terror is less scary inherently than what it was before. So it does feel to me that Amnesia Dark Descent was less scary towards the end, which is just an unfortunate part of the formula. I'm not really sure I've seen very many horror movies or games or whatever that really break that mold and have a scarier latter half without having it degenerate into sort of slasher, gore fest or action movie, which is a bit unfortunate. But the story, for that reason, I think it's very good for what it is, but it does have the same old sort of tropes, I guess, that your horror genre is going to have. So that is basically my opinion of the game in a nutshell. It's got a very strong narrative that I didn't necessarily relate to, but I can tell it's fairly strong, and it's going to relate to some other people quite effectively. The mechanics I didn't really think were necessary. They were there. They could have been not there, and it wouldn't have made any difference to me in particular, and in some cases it would have been improved by removing parts of it. Especially some of the more difficult puzzles where they didn't highlight the interactable objects. That's sort of an error of consistency. Maybe if they had highlighted in purple objects that I could have interacted with in some of those, like finding the oil in that one. I didn't actually see how it was different from the water at first because it's not distinctly immediate on my monitor, but puzzles like that I think could have been made at least more consistent to make them easier to get through to a certain degree, because I don't want to be stuck in the same room for 20 minutes. That kills the fear, that kills the terror, that kills the idea of tension, and instead introduces frustration into it, and that's just the wrong feeling to get from a horror game. So the mechanics, I think, were a little bit of a weak point of this game, but they typically are in all horror games. There are very few horror games that are very strong mechanically. And lastly, of course, back to the beginning, the atmosphere and the pacing and the ambiance, all of those were very, very well done. It was very well timed in terms of producing tension. The areas that you had to be in, I think, for longer than others were the ones that made me feel most uncomfortable, and it was all around very good at that. So this was definitely a very good horror game, but I should distinctly note that there are two different kinds of horror games in the market right now. There are survival horror games where the emphasis is on survival, and there are psychological horror games where the emphasis is on scaring you or disturbing you or making you feel something. This is the latter type. And not everybody can appreciate necessarily psychological horror. They're not necessarily willing to get into the head of the character. This one, it's not so much that I wasn't willing to get into the head of Daniel, it's that I just could not empathize with him and on a human level. So for me, it didn't work out very well, but I can tell still from an outside point of view that particular part of it was still there. But despite that, these psychological horror games aren't for everybody. Some people just don't want to get immersed into it. That some people just want to, have an adrenaline rush, and that's not what this kind of game is. That's that sort of slower feeling of fear. That sort of slow feeling of discomfort and paranoia and delusion. That's this kind of game, and it's much, much more profound for some people. If you're not that kind of person, I would recommend Outlast. I personally didn't like it because I don't think that anything in there was scary. Personally, I think it was an action game, and that's how it felt to me. and that's sort of how I approached that game. So if you prefer that adrenaline style where you've got a very jolted feeling and that stimulates the idea that you're in a fight or flight situation, that stimulates that kind of fear, Amnesia is not necessarily going to be a very good game for you. So I would consider what kind of horror you would like before I would consider recommending this game. But if you do like that slow psychological horror, Amnesia is a very good game for that. Anyway, that's my retrospective of Amnesia: A Dark Descent. I hope you found this informative, and I hope to see you around for my retrospective on Amnesia: A Machine for Pigs.